So let me say this whole policy and operations thing was something that bugged me forever, because when I learned sociocracy, it just never made sense. It just never made sense to me until at some point I was determined to understand this whole topic. And I realized that maybe either I never really understood it the way it was explained to me, or maybe the way it was explained to me wasn't accurate enough. So I've now found a way that I find makes perfect sense. And the feedback that I've gotten from people is that they appreciate my way of explaining it. So I'm not sure whether this is the way, but I've decided not to care anymore because it works. Okay, so it's, and maybe you listen to it and you say, obviously, what else would it be? Or maybe it's clarifying to you. And I don't know. This is the first time I'm doing this particular class. So I'd be curious at the end to hear how much sense that made to you and what was clarifying. And maybe you say, that's all no-brainers. Then I'm envious, because then you had an easier start than I did. So one thing I want to acknowledge is I like using examples, sort of, because I think it supports the memorizing of a topic when it's sort of, at least in my brain, if it's connected to a theme. The theme today is tree houses, and I realized maybe that's the thing I picked because of Kate being here, because their community is called Treehouse. But it is also a very sweet image that we can all understand. So I like working with examples that everybody can understand. So you're going to see this treehouse a few times and some other ones too. So how I was taught about this difference between policy and operations is the following thing. And it sounds so intriguing and so simple and so true. Operations is what we do. And policy is decisions on how we do it. You listen to that and go, okay, makes perfect sense. And yet, there was always this question in me of like, so what is operational decisions? Isn't that a decision on how we do the operations? How's that then different from policy? The difference between operations and policy is easy, but the difference between operational decisions and policy decisions is not easy at all. Or actually, it's easy, but it needs to be said well so that it becomes easy, I guess, is what I want to say. So I will focus on the difference between operational decisions and policy, because what doing is we all understand. So the policy versus operation is really a shortcut for the decision sphere. But let me start with this, to start on the treehouse topic. This is me at about 5 years old, I think, maybe 4, looks more like 4 years old, climbing on a tree. And this is one of my fondest childhood memories. This is a tree house. We call it a tree house. And I showed it to my daughter, my oldest daughter, this morning. And she was like, it involves a tree, right? Because it's not even off the ground, this thing, right? So we were just attaching whatever we found. I grew up next to a construction site, best place ever. And we built this thing that we called a treehouse. Later, we built a better treehouse, but that was the initial treehouse. That is still, until this day, the treehouse of my dreams, because it was the best, one of the best days ever, because we had this neighborhood thing and so on. The reason I'm telling the story is because when kids get together and build something, they're self-managed, right? And we can all tap into the wisdom that we had as children, because the whole self-management thing, sometimes I want to start a rant about how we're trying to teach something that is absolutely obvious, because we all are self-managing ourselves all the time. It's not a new thing. We just have to sort of remember what was obvious to us then. So the treehouse metaphor is basically an attempt to snap you into that thinking that we had then, because we tend to sort of, all the grown-up knowledge tends to sometimes cover up things, and we think that we, are not as obvious as they were to us once. So just remember your whatever corresponds to my memory for you. Just hold that somewhere inside of you for while I'm talking. When we start building a treehouse, or when we start a startup, everything is operations, right? We just go do, that's what we do. And we make decisions along the way. And every operation that we do is simply carried out by somebody, right? So if you think back to the treehouse situation, that's what happens. And as I said, operational decisions are made all the time by different sets of people. You know, the two people putting on the roof decide how they do that. The two people buying nails decide what kind of nails they buy, and so on. So that is sort of our image of self-governance for some people, or self-management, is that everybody just does things and they decide it on their own. But I'm going to refine that later. So now, of course, things get a little bit more complicated. So in the startup situation, everything is easy because everything is open and undefined. In a way that's easy, in a way that's hard. So, but now, of course, as we cooperate more, we have to make some operational decisions as a group, and then things get a little complicated, and over time, we will shift some of our decisions into policy. So the way I think about it, it's sort of from the very undefined to more definition. So we start to differentiate, and we make decisions that, for example, in an organizational context, define our governance system, how we decide. We define our circle structure in a Sociocratic context, and we define basic agreements. And those basic agreements are always what I hold as policy, as roles, and sort of who does what is allowed and what is not allowed. Oh, that's double, right? What is allowed and no, permitted. No, hold on. Forbidden is the word that I wanted here. And then how we do things. So sort of workflow decisions. I want to point out to you that sociocracy is rather radical in that even the governance system is a policy of the organization. It's not something that falls from the sky. It's something you can change. An organization can change the governance system, which is a little different from holacracy, where the constitution is it starts sort of with the constitution. We sort of start with a primordial soup of, like that, everything is negotiable. And also your circle structure is basically policy. It's just policy that you hardly ever look at. On your governance system, you wouldn't revise it, every week, and also not every year, but maybe every year if it's fresh, But for example, in my community, we look at our governance document, every few years. So we actually do review it. It's a piece of policy. Also needs to live somewhere, by the way. All right, that's a side comment. So so I'm not going to focus on those two. I just wanted to mention that it's also policy, okay? But I'm going to focus on this level of policy, is what we sort of typically understand as policy. So, and I'm just basically going to say a very similar thing many times, because in my experience and explaining it to people, that's how it clicks. So you're going to hear the same thing in different variations. Don't get confused if you think, oh, you already said that. Yes, I already did say it, and I will say it a few more times. And that is the following thing. So a operational decision is a one-time decision, basically in the moment, often, but doesn't have to necessarily be that way. But the point is, it applies to one instance of like one moment or one example. But a policy decision is basically more like a bulk decision of, okay, in all similar situations like this is whatever, the decision is. So for example, here, this, by the way, is one of my kids, workshop in the community. And so if something gets dusty, they just put on those masks, right? Just like if something is loud, they put on the ear protection. That's just what they do, and they know where that stuff is, and they can just decide that. This is, of course, a different situation. So here now it's a policy. You don't have the choice as an individual. You don't have the choice to do it when you think it's a good idea, to sort of add that. So here that decision is made for you because it's just a policy that applies to everybody all the time. Okay. So here it's sort of a pop-up kind of thing, depending on what you think you do. And here it is generic. You could imagine how those from the outside look exactly the same. For example, if all kids or all people in the workshop decide to just wear those masks all the time for whatever reason, from the outside as a visitor, you wouldn't know whether that's a rule or whether that's just a choice. So from the outside, you don't actually see it. But I think that there is a reality to it, and I'm going to talk about that later. There is a reality to the difference, and we all know it, I think. So Another instance of me repeating the same thing. An operational decision is a decision on one instance, case, event, whatever, while a policy decision is on many similar instances, cases, or events. The big difference is, and that's why it's so relevant to know the difference, or at least have a sense of how to talk about the difference, is that operational decisions are made by authority. So whoever has the power to make the decision makes the decision, while a policy decision is made by consent in the circle where it lives. So in that domain. Those are very different processes, right? So it's, yeah, and I will have a lot of gray zone kind of examples where you will see that you probably also have an intuition about where something lands. And in the gray zone, we might have, our intuitions might differ. So that's where it gets interesting. And the whole conceptual thinking that I'm giving you is really just to give you sort of a way to think about it and words to talk about it so that you can be intentional about how you respond. So if we build a treehouse, an operational decision, for example, is how to get into the treehouse. Okay, so I'm thinking about a treehouse that looks like the one that we see here on the right. If you see it, you might have to move the Zoom stuff. So there we have a big ladder, okay, and I as a parent look at that and go like, all right, you know, I mean, every kid, if unsupervised, they would probably just climb up however they want to. And I think if I'm the parent standing there, I would say, all right, people, I want you to, both hands on the ladder at all times, only one kid at a time, and always whatever, belly to the ladder kind of thing. Okay, so this would be a policy that a parent might make in the treehouse situation. So that's sort of a top-down decision that comes from the higher circle, if you wish. Yet there are also decisions that I can imagine kids making. For example, let's say Christine didn't help build the treehouse. Can she go in or not? So now, how would that sound like? It would say, okay, Christine wants to, play in the treehouse, and the kids would say, do you think Christine should be allowed to play? Yeah, I guess. Okay, sure, come in. Or we could say, well, do you think people who didn't help build should be allowed to play here? And then you make a decision about the generic case, because now that's going to apply to everything. And that's why I want to talk about how that has a sort of mental conceptual reality, because if we make this decision, an operational decision, and then that's for some reason somebody questions that, we could say, no, we've decided that Christine can come in. While this sounds very different. We had said that only people who help build can join us. That's a different decision, and everybody knows that. Every kid knows the difference. Did you make a generic decision or a one-off? So it's not complicated. We all have a sense of what that is, and that is the difference. So did we make the decision about Christine, or did we make the decision about a whole set of people that have the same property as in they helped us build? And for example, I was playing with something because we had that rule in my treehouse in my neighborhood when I grew up. We actually had the rule that only, the kids from a certain part of the neighborhood, sort of our kids, were allowed to be in our treehouse, as kids tend to be territorial. So that for us was a clear rule, and that rule was also enforced. And we might have made exceptions. I don't remember any, to be honest, but we had a clear rule about that. If now somebody observes from the outside, they might not see the rule, and yet the rule is very real. It could also be, for example, that if you have a rule that, it could get complicated. Only people who help build can join us unless they also live in the neighborhood. Then they invited all that they weren't there. So there are all kinds of constructs that people can come up with and that kids do all the time, right? And they will enforce that, and it has a reality to those people. So before I bring two more examples, let me sort of harvest what the point is about policy here. So policy we make to simplify and clarify operations or operational decisions, anything that has to do with that. So we want to go for efficiency and quality decisions and so on. You could add fairness in there, but I tend to not talk about fairness. That's more an intentionality thing. So if we make a decision that we want to be a good decision, we want to hear more people, so that has to do with consideration, but we also just want to be sure that we know what goes into the decision. What, that's where we would do picture farming, proposal shaping, and so on, to really make sure that we capture everything. The good thing about an intentional decision compared to a one-off, a one-time decision, is that it can be tracked and sort of followed over time. How did that decision affect things over time? What did that do to whatever metrics you have? So that's a big advantage of policy. And then, of course, equivalence, a big one, especially in a system with consent, because you would have a situation where somebody can say no. If you have a set of operational decisions, there is never a moment where somebody can say no, because you sort of establish a pattern that is sometimes not acknowledged, but I'll talk more about that later. So operational decisions, yes, they're quick, they're easy, they're flexible, people are empowered to make a decision that feels good. Policy decisions are intentional, considerate, you hear objections, you can make it safe, you can hear everybody who's involved, and so on. There is, so the sort of cons of operational decisions, they're often unquestioned, as I said, and hard to track, because you can't really follow the trail as well. Policy decisions have disadvantage too, right? Because they tend to be heavy, sort of slow, they can be rigid, and they require maintenance. Every policy you have, at least if you're a good sociocrat, you put a review term, you review it after a certain term and so on. You wanna take care of that policy. It becomes a thing that you have to take care of. It's like a piece of equipment that you have to take care of. All right, somebody is unmuted. Now two more examples, just to sort of leave the treehouse example and the other example that I had behind real quick. Here's a standard example that I bring. You might have heard it from me before, but I find it a relatable thing. So since we're all part of organizations somewhere, we all have a sense of what issues are around membership. So let's say you are appointed as the person who sends materials to prospective members, people who inquire about the organization. So somebody, having been in that situation, it's like somebody sends you an email and then, they say, I'm interested in this organization. You say, great. And then you want to send them something, and you send them this article and you send them to that website and maybe there's a little brochure you have. And then 3 weeks later, somebody sends you an email and says, hey, I'm interested in the organization. And you write an email again that, might be similar, might be different. You sort of make it up and from scratch every time. Well, a policy decision would be, all right, whenever somebody contacts us, they get the same list of things, within the same time frame and so on. That would be a policy decision. Then similar to the treehouse example, actually, when kids decide who gets to play, decision on membership, you might make those individual decisions. That typically happens with young organizations. There's nothing wrong about that. But then at some point, you might want to establish membership categories, just because it's draining to make a decision all the time and it doesn't scale at all and so on. So one important thing to me here is that those look like they have a different nature. Let's see, no, let me rephrase that. They look like they look like they have a different nature, but really it's the same decision. It's just really the number of elements that we make it about that is the difference. So for example, here, it's not that everything in establishing a process on materials for prospective members is now guided. For example, you might not have defined in this policy how soon the materials have to be sent. Okay, so that might require policy or to refine policy at some point. But unless it's defined, the person who holds that process can do it whenever they want to. And at some point, if that becomes an issue for whatever reason, you might include that in your policy. So you refine and refine and refine and refine, and more in tendency, more and more operational decisions turn into policy decisions as that is needed. That is the typical sort of evolution of an organization, formal or informal organization. Another example. So now sort of more more grown-up organization like even. So let's say, and this is actually something that came up for me in SOFA here recently. So right now, as things are, because SOFA is still a young organization, we're still very much forming and storming. The people who are on staff each decide what their email signature says. By email signature, I mean something like that, right? The thing that it says when you send an email. So we all just decide that, and you know, it's not that somebody checks that or anything. Just people do whatever they think they do, exactly like in a treehouse situation. The kids just start hammering nails somewhere. If we at some point want to change that, we could guide, for example, what has to be in the signature. Like we want all of us to go to the website. We want all of us to have our book time with me link. We want all of us to whatever. Okay, link to the book. That could be or to Facebook. Whatever the decision might be, it would be a decision that would then apply to everybody. One can even then refine it more. One can even say, you know, so for example, hold on, let me back up. A similar example, but a little bit different, is that somebody just decides to make signatures for everybody and sends them to people and say, hey, paste that in your, you know, in your email provider. Just use that. I made that for you. So they all, you know, and they then would probably all look similar, but that's still just an operational decision. It's just still somebody. It's a little bit the counterpart of a kid handing nails to each individual kid and say, hey, use this nail, okay? But it's not a policy decision on, from now on, for these kind of woodworks things, we're only gonna use this type of nail. That's different, okay? It's a mental representation thing of, did we just happen to all use the same nail because we were given the same nail, or have we made a decision together that that's how we would operate? So now, the gray zone cases. And that's where it gets tricky. So hold on, actually, before you read that. So what I said was, an operational decision, we make a decision about one thing. In a policy decision, we make a decision about all the similar things, all the prospective members, all the nails, all the signatures, and so on, okay? Yet, it's not that easy, because basically the difference is between indefinitely many, or, you know, many versus one, right? That's the difference. It's basically a mathematical difference. So there's one for operational decisions and many or even all for policy decisions. What happens if the set of all is only one or two things? Is that now an operational decision, or is it a policy decision? What if it's 1 plus 1 and then another one? And I'm going to give you concrete examples of that, where I tend to struggle and sometimes have to sort of ground myself a little to know what to do. So, for example, if we make agreements and we make decisions on individual cases, it depends a little on how we argue. So, for example, if we make exempt people from certain rules, and we're sort of setting precedents, then that can easily blur into a policy decision, although it was one-offs. It depends on how we talk about it, really. So, for example, it could be, you know, one day we invite Christine to play with us, and the next day it's another kid, and then another kid. And with the third kid, we might argue, no, we'd already, you know, allowed the other two kids. So obviously, it seems to be our rule that kids from outside our neighborhood can play with us. And then if people say, yeah, okay, you know, Michael is allowed to play, what did they just agree to? Is it the policy, or is it just Michael? And people don't have clarity about that. And that creates friction quite a bit. A similar thing is that sometimes I see sociocratic circles and I'm saying it without judgment, it's just an observation because I share what's driving that. I see them make decisions by consent on significant but events that happen only once. Because the theory says if it's an operational decision, somebody just go makes it. But that's not how we actually act. And I'm sure you've all been part of a group that decided by consent on something that was just an operational decision. So we're not actually sticking to what we say about operational decisions are made by authority and circles make decisions by consent on policy. That's not what we actually do. So that's interesting. So for example, I was last night part of a circle that made a decision by policy on really basically a workflow that we knew would happen exactly once in our lifetime. But it was really complicated because we had sort of scenario planning in there of like, so-and-so's going to send an email to so-and-so. If within 48 hours we don't hear back, then this will happen. So we had it all spelled out. And it turned out to be as much work as any policy would be for one time. And we decided by consent. And I found it was the right decision to decide by consent because it was really, really significant. Like every word had to be right in that one. And we had to be absolutely clear that we all understand. So it was an operational decision, but we made it as if it were policy with the same sort of level of intentionality and the same level of consideration that I would expect from policymaking. So when things are very important, I say, we tend to shift more into policy mode, even though it's just once. And then I think the poster case example for the difference between policy and operations is filling roles. So we make decisions on who fills a role by consent, right? In the selection process, at the end is consent. Now, thinking about that for a long time, like why are we using consent here? How's that a policy decision? But it is a policy decision because basically the same frame applies of we're not just making a decision that whatever, Christine be facilitator once, but we're saying for all the meetings, you know, within a certain time frame, it applies that Christine will be facilitator. So we're not making a decision about a one thing, we're making a decision about a whole set of things. We put a term on it, but still it's sort of from now on indefinitely until the term is up kind of thing. So it is basically like a policy decision, just a funky one, somehow that feels funky in my brain at least. So let's accept that filling a role by consent is basically a policy decision on who's going to be facilitator in the circle for that period of time. Now, what happens if a facilitator is absent? How do we appoint who's going to facilitate? And I know circles struggle with that because then some people say we should do a selection process. But a selection process, like that takes 20 minutes to appoint a facilitator for one meeting, that seems overkill. And what people struggle with then is the like, oh, we just have to make an operational decision. So basically, for example, the leader appoints somebody, period. And we don't even need consent on that. It's just being appointed because it's too small of a set to be a big deal. It's just one meeting. If it feels very touchy, then it goes more sort of to the significant kind of decision place. And then you might want to do it by consent. But you see how those two blur, and it really has to do with numbers quite a bit. So I've mentioned a few times what I would call practice, and that is basically unacknowledged operational decisions that we just happen to make the same way every time. So do I have an example here? No, I do not have an example here. So let's say we have a practice of let's just use the membership example. So we are the membership circle and we have a practice that we invite somebody before they have to decide of whether they want to be a member and have a conversation with them. We never make a policy that that's how we operate. It's just what we happen to do. Okay. Now this is more in the realm of a practice. Because it's not in policy, but we do it every time. It's like an operational decision that we do every time, but we don't actively make it. We just sort of operate on habit. And that's great because that makes life so much easier. Operate on habit, that's great, you know, because it means you don't have to every time decide that you're going to invite that prospective member, yet again a prospective member. You know, it's like it would be silly to just pretend like it's a new and unique situation every time. So practices are good, yet of course there's some balance here, because there are also many practices that fall into the "this is how we've always done it" kind of category. It's not a policy. That means you can't object, right? If it's not a policy, that means you can't object. So habits and practices can sort of be a sneaky way of doing things without giving people a chance to say no. And then it becomes a problem. So there are, as for practices and habits, they're both sides, right? One is the rule: if it ain't broken, don't fix it. So if you have a good swing of things, you know, and you're doing something without having put it into policy, but it works for everybody, don't start a 2-hour discussion on whether this should be a policy. That seems, there's too many of them. You would spend forever doing that. Yet, if something happens for years and for years and for years, and there's no place to ever question it, and it is a problem, then you need to sort of switch it into policy and have a chance to change what the practice is. Actually, yeah. So we're almost towards the end, by the way, of sort of my monologue here. I've been lectured by somebody who studied that, which was interesting, that the way all this works is actually very easy, because in sociocracy, and also in holacracy, as far as my understanding is, roles, agreements, workflows, so everything that's policy just regulates everything, and people just go carry it out. So all the ideas that all the operational decisions follow from policy decisions. That is sort of the textbook way of saying it. Okay. To be honest, I find that deeply flawed. It's conceptually sweet, but it's not the reality of things, because it ignores the bad practices, ignores how much leeway people have all the time, and so on. So it's simply not realistic. You will not be able to regulate everything. Plus, I wouldn't want to. So this is not a complete picture. And then, sort of just to provoke you on the other side, I'm not saying this is necessarily something that everybody says, but I know some people carry this ideal of self-management just being anybody can just decide anything. But that's also nonsense. No organization would actually operate that way. It might look and feel like that, but I'm sure there are a lot of, at least, practices that people might not even notice, but they're still in place, because it would mean way too much effort to have to decide everything all the time by somebody. That doesn't seem like a real thing. So you can see how those are sort of opposed, right? And this makes it sound like operations are basically predetermined and implications out of something that is defined. And this makes it sound like nothing is ever defined and everything just is spontaneous. And that's not true. So I want to advocate to just know about those things, because what you do with it is your choice. I just want people to understand the pattern that is underneath and how it's very real for people, because if it's real, we have to factor it in, right? And ideally, we would find a sweet spot here. This is my last slide, and it's a cheesy slide, because I want you to look at the faces. This is an internet picture, so, you know, low resolution. But I mean, we can almost fill in the gap of, we know what this feels like, right? We built this thing, it's super dangerous, but we did it ourselves, you know, like, this is pride, this is empowerment that we see there, right? And if we give people a chance to decide a lot, that's how they feel. They have to take ownership and so on. So in that chaos, for some people, that's heavily liberating and sweet, and they have full agency and so on. Okay. And then on the other hand, some people get nervous in this kind of situation, like parents, but also people who just, you know, some kids are really into sort of order and a little bit more reliability and so on. It's not a matter of age, actually. It has a big personality aspect to it. But sort of the opposite would be, you know, like something super orderly and polished and so on. And this is actually a treehouse. I Googled fancy tree houses to find this. The reason I say that is because it almost doesn't look, this to me is not even a treehouse anymore. If I told my kid, let's build a treehouse, you know, they would be excited. But then if I say, oh, and this is what we're going to build, I know the energy would drop and you're like, whoa, that sounds like I'm going to be told what to do quite a lot, because this is not something a 5-year-old can just build, or a 10-year-old, or a 12-year-old, or any of us, to be honest. This requires a whole lot of differentiation, expertise, and rules, and so on, to make such a thing happen. So, of course, that is desirable sometimes. Well, this is also desirable sometimes. I don't want to be part of a startup where everybody just defines policy for 2 years before they even lift a finger. But I also don't want to be part of an organization that is 20 years old and has 100 employees and runs like that. So everything has their time and their place. I just want people to be aware. This is very policy heavy, and this is very operations heavy, with basically no policy, at least no acknowledged policy that we would know. So I hope that made sense, because this is my last slide. So just to be clear, I want people to see their place within that balance of, hey, let's make my operations decisions, or hey, let's make my policy decisions, and find a spot where they're comfortable, where not every step they make is completely micromanaged, but also there's enough clarity so people know what they're doing and they don't run away, run around throwing their arms into the air all the time. Hands, I think. All right. So how do you notice if you're leaning too far in one or the other direction? So if you make too many operational decisions and not enough policy decisions, it has a sense of chaos, lack of clarity, tensions come up, and so on. This is a word that non-native speakers might not know, untethered. It's basically when something like this, a tether ball, for example, a ball is attached with a string, or a string to a pole. And if it comes up, you know, it starts sort of getting chaotic. So it's untethered, sort of not grounded. It's another way of saying it. If you make too many policy decisions, things move slow. For example, people start to disengage because everything is complicated. Before you can do anything, you first have to, you know, write down a role description. You have to do this, you have to do that before you can, you know, buy a new pen. That's just no fun. And people start to rebel. They simply refuse to do it. They just make things happen. That's because it's too rigid and it holds them in place too much. And you might have so many policies that don't even know your policies because you have too many of them and you can't track them, and that really they don't really apply to your reality as much as you thought. So you want to be somewhere in between, and chances are you won't always hit the perfect spot, but you want to be aware of the two sides so that you can steer in both directions, right? Governance is about steering. That's where the idea comes from, that you would steer and sort of make it, you make your way forward without it being a straight line. So I don't think there's such a thing as perfect, but there is such a thing as a sweet spot.